20 years after The Passion of the Christ tore through movie theaters and split critics right down the middle, its director sat down across from the most listened to podcaster on the planet and said something that reframed the entire film. Not a plot twist, not a hidden Easter egg buried in the editing. Something closer to a confession about what the movie was actually trying to do and why almost nobody at the time fully understood it. The setting was ordinary enough. January 9th, 2025, Mel Gibson, 69 years old, sitting across from Rogan in Austin, Texas, while wildfires tore through Southern California back home. Close enough to his own neighborhood that he later admitted he spent part of the conversation wondering if his house was still standing. He even worked a dry joke about it into the episode, suggesting the state's tax dollars had gone toward the governor's hair gel instead of fire prevention. A small, dark bit of levity that stood out against the weight of everything discussed afterward. Nobody watching expected a masterclass in ancient forensics, contested church history, and the exact theological argument Gibson had built his most controversial film around. But that's roughly what they got over the course of a conversation that ran close to 3 hours. To understand why this conversation mattered, you have to go back to 2004 and to the fight it took just to get The Passion of the Christ made in the first place. Gibson has been open, across multiple interviews, about how much resistance he ran into. Hollywood studios wanted almost nothing to do with a film shot largely in Aramaic and Latin, depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus' life in unflinching, brutal detail. No major studio would fully back it. Gibson ended up financing much of the $25 to $30 million budget out of his own pocket, essentially betting his own fortune on a film almost every executive in town had passed on. On Rogan's podcast, he described the pushback plainly, saying that any film willing to touch that subject matter was always going to draw people out of the woodwork, because it's simply too big a subject to leave anyone neutral. He was right about the reaction, in both directions. Despite the resistance, or maybe partly because of the controversy surrounding it, The Passion of the Christ became the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history, pulling in over $370 million domestically against that modest budget. It also became one of the most argued-over films of the decade. Some religious leaders praised it as the most viscerally accurate depiction of the crucifixion ever put on screen, and church groups across denominations organized mass theater bookings, treating the film as something closer to an outreach event than an ordinary movie release. Others, including a number of scholars and Jewish organizations, raised serious concerns that certain scenes echoed centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes about culpability for the crucifixion, a controversy that dogged the film through its entire theatrical run and that Gibson has pushed back on repeatedly over the years, arguing the film's actual message was the opposite of what critics claimed. The debate wasn't helped years later when Gibson's own recorded remarks during a separate, unrelated 2006 arrest included anti-Semitic language he later apologized for publicly, an episode that continues to shadow how some critics rate his earlier work even 2 decades on. And that argument is where the Rogan conversation actually gets interesting, because Gibson used it to lay out, more plainly than he had in most prior interviews, exactly what he intended the film to communicate. His point, as he explained it to Rogan, wasn't about assigning blame to any one group standing at the foot of the cross 2,000 years ago. It was about universal responsibility, the idea that the crucifixion in Christian theology represents a sacrifice made on behalf of everyone, meaning every person in every era shares some form of moral stake in it. Gibson framed the film's brutality not as a historical accusation aimed outward, but as a mirror aimed at the audience itself. This is what your redemption cost, according to the story, and it wasn't cheap or bloodless. He went further, describing the physical suffering depicted in the film as something he deliberately refused to soften. Because, in his view, sanitizing it would have let audiences keep the story at a comfortable emotional distance, instead of confronting what the theology actually claims happened. That's the what everyone missed thread running underneath the entire conversation. Not a secret scene or a hidden symbol, but the film's actual thesis, delivered 20 years later in plainer language than the movie itself ever used. From there, the conversation widened into territory that had almost nothing to do with film criticism and everything to do with what Gibson personally believes is verifiable fact. He told Rogan flatly that he regards the Gospels as history, not allegory, not myth, but what he called verifiable history, pointing to non-biblical historical sources that reference the existence of Jesus as a real historical figure. Whether or not you find that framing persuasive, it's a real position with real scholarly debate behind it. The existence of Jesus as a historical person is broadly accepted among historians across a wide range of religious and secular backgrounds, even among many who reject the theological claims made about him. What remains, genuinely contested among scholars, isn't whether a historical Jesus existed, but how much of the gospel narrative reflects contemporaneous eyewitness reporting versus later theological composition. A distinction Gibson's framing tends to collapse, treating the Gospels as straightforward historical reportage rather than texts written, compiled, and edited by different communities over subsequent decades. The resurrection, Gibson said, is a different category of claim entirely, one he described as requiring more faith than almost anything else in the story. His argument, paraphrased, was essentially a challenge. Point to another historical figure who was executed publicly and then, according to eyewitness accounts, returned 3 days later. He didn't think there was a comparable example, and he drew a specific contrast with Buddha, noting that no equivalent resurrection claim exists at the center of Buddhist tradition. It's a rhetorical move, common in Christian apologetics, framing the resurrection as historically unique, rather than assessing it purely as a theological or metaphysical claim, and it's one that plenty of religious scholars and comparative religion academics would push back on, pointing out that resurrection and rebirth narratives, in different forms, appear across a number of ancient traditions, even if none map onto the Christian claim exactly. Then the conversation turned to a piece of physical evidence Gibson clearly finds far more convincing than most professional archaeologists do: the Shroud of Turin, a relic that had already been back in the news in the weeks before the episode aired, thanks to a separate Italian research team publishing a new study arguing for a much older date range than the traditional medieval verdict. The shroud is a 14-foot linen cloth bearing the faint photographic negative image of a crucified man, long claimed by some to be the burial cloth of Jesus. It has been debated for over a century, studied by chemists, forensic pathologists, art historians, and physicists, each bringing a different theory to a mystery none of them has fully settled. A formal 1988 radiocarbon dating test, conducted by 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, dated the cloth's fibers to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD, squarely medieval and widely treated by mainstream science as strong evidence against the shroud's authenticity as a first-century relic. Gibson doesn't accept that dating, and he laid out his reasoning to Rogan in some detail. His central claim was that the 1988 sample was taken from a section of the cloth that had been patched or repaired after a documented fire in the 1500s, meaning the test may have measured newer repair fibers rather than the original weave. He also referenced more recent research, using different dating techniques, X-ray-based structural analysis published by an Italian research team that has produced far older date ranges, closer to the 1st century, though this newer method remains contested within the broader scientific community and has not displaced the original carbon dating consensus. Gibson went further still, describing pollen and blood stain analysis that he believes points to a Middle Eastern origin and a blood type pattern consistent with certain ancient populations, and he raised the idea, echoed by a handful of physicists over the years, that whatever created the image on the cloth might have involved some kind of intense, brief release of energy that ordinary artistic techniques can't replicate. A burst powerful enough, in his telling, to leave a mark a modern science still can't fully reproduce in a laboratory. It's worth being precise about where the actual evidence stands, because this is a genuinely contested area, not a settled one. The original carbon dating remains the most cited scientific test on the shroud and continues to be defended by many researchers as sound, and mainstream critics have raised their own objections to Gibson's repair fabric theory, noting that the sampling protocol in 1988 was designed specifically to avoid visibly patched sections. The newer, older dating studies exist and have been published, but they use different, less established methodologies and have not resolved the broader scientific debate. Critics of Gibson's position argue he's selectively citing the research that supports his existing belief while downplaying the studies that don't. His defenders counter that mainstream institutions have been just as selective in the other direction, quick to treat one 1988 test as final while giving less attention to later findings that complicate it. Nobody, including the researchers Gibson referenced, claims to have definitively proven how the image itself was formed. What Gibson offered Rogan wasn't a settled scientific verdict. It was his own confident interpretation of a genuinely unresolved question, presented with the same certainty he brings to everything else. That same certainty carried straight into the most pointed part of the conversation: Gibson's views on the modern Catholic Church itself. Gibson, a lifelong Catholic, told Rogan he doesn't accept the legitimacy of what he called the post-conciliar church, meaning the version of Catholicism that has existed since the Second Vatican Council reshaped major elements of Catholic liturgy and doctrine between 1962 and 1965. He referenced a term used by the excommunicated Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, counterfeit parallel church, to describe an institution he believes has drifted from the faith it was originally built on, and suggested its current leadership bears some responsibility for the child abuse scandals that have devastated the church's credibility over the past several decades. In the same conversation, he described the Vatican in starker terms still, alleging that predatory behavior within its hierarchy had gone unaddressed for far too long, and that Pope Francis himself bore some responsibility for allowing that pattern to continue. This isn't a fringe position Gibson invented on the spot. It aligns closely with a real, decades-old movement called sedevacantism, Latin for the seat is vacant, whose adherents believe the papacy has effectively been unoccupied by a legitimate pope since Vatican II, on the theory that the council itself represented such a serious break from prior Catholic teaching that everything built on top of it lost its legitimate authority. It's a minority position within Catholicism, rejected by the institutional church and by the overwhelming majority of practicing Catholics. But it has a real history, and Gibson's own father, Hutton Gibson, his son, brought the idea to one of the largest podcast audiences in the world. Hutton published a newsletter promoting these views for years, and friends and biographers have long noted his influence on how Mel was raised to think about the institutional church. Gibson didn't stop at general criticism. He brought up a specific, contested piece of church history, the 1958 papal conclave that elected Angelo Roncalli as Pope John XXIII, the pope who would go on to convene Vatican II. Gibson referenced what's sometimes called the Syri thesis, a theory circulating within sedevacantist circles holding that Cardinal Giuseppe Syri of Genoa was actually elected pope during that conclave, or possibly a later one, and that the election was somehow reversed or suppressed. A theory partly built around eyewitness accounts describing the smoke over the Sistine Chapel as ambiguously colored before Vatican Radio ultimately confirmed a pope had, in fact, been chosen. It's a claim with no support from mainstream church historians, and one that has been directly refuted by researchers who have examined the conclave records, but Gibson raised it to Rogan as a serious possibility worth taking seriously, tying it back to his broader argument that the church's current leadership traces back to an illegitimate break in succession. Catholic commentators who reviewed the episode afterward were split on how to respond. Some praised Gibson's blunt public defense of the resurrection and the historical Jesus, treating the sheer size of Rogan's audience as a rare, valuable platform for mainstream Christian apologetics, regardless of Gibson's other views. Others, including voices from mainstream Catholic apologetics organizations, pushed back hard on the sedevacantist framing specifically, calling it a serious theological error dressed up as plain speaking, and worrying aloud that listeners unfamiliar with church history might walk away treating a fringe conspiracy theory as an established fact simply because it came from someone as culturally influential as Gibson. One prominent Catholic podcast host summed up his reaction by saying there was plenty in the episode he agreed with, and one direction Gibson took the conversation that he considered genuinely harmful to listeners trying to understand their own faith. Formal church teaching, for what it's worth, treats Vatican II as a legitimate and binding council, and the vast majority of Catholic bishops, theologians, and lay people worldwide simply don't engage with sedevacantism as a live theological question at all. Rogan, for his part, mostly let it play out. He's not a Catholic and didn't claim any particular expertise on church history, but listeners noted a shift in his tone as the conversation moved from film history into contested theology and unresolved forensic science. Less the skeptical needling he's known for with certain guests, more genuine curiosity, occasionally punctuated by exactly the kind of open-ended, half-convinced reactions that fueled the wave of clipped highlight videos the episode generated across social platforms in the days afterward. Clips of the Shroud discussion alone racked up millions of views within the first week, repackaged under dozens of different, increasingly dramatic titles, promising viewers a secret Gibson had supposedly just revealed. The conversation wasn't only heavy theology and forensic argument either. Gibson and Rogan spent real time on lighter, more personal terrain, Gibson's own history with addiction, his account of overcoming alcoholism, and how he connects that experience of hitting bottom and finding a way back to the redemption themes that run through so much of his filmmaking, passion included. He talked about storytelling itself, recommending books like The Frontiersman, and discussing how a good war story or a good crisis story can teach as much about faith and human nature as Scripture does directly. The two also drifted into territory far outside religion entirely, debating evolution and the reliability of carbon dating more broadly, discussing the mysterious, much older than expected stone structures at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, and even trading theories about the Ark of the Covenant and the disputed location of Golgotha, the hill where the crucifixion is traditionally believed to have taken place. It's easy to lose that part of the conversation underneath the louder, more shareable clips about the Shroud and the Vatican, but by Gibson's own framing, it's the same underlying thread, the idea that suffering, crucifixion 2,000 years ago, or a personal battle with addiction decades ago. Gibson also confirmed something fans of the original film had been asking about for 2 decades, a follow-up project, focused not on the crucifixion itself, but on the resurrection and its aftermath, is actively in development, with Jim Caviezel expected to return in the lead role. Gibson described it as an even more difficult film to make than the first. Belief? There's no equivalent historical or physical reference point to draw from the way there was for depicting a Roman crucifixion. He suggested the project would deal directly with the psychological and spiritual aftermath for the disciples, people who watched their teacher die in public and then had to reckon with reports that he hadn't stayed dead. So what did Joe Rogan actually get shocked by if you strip away the clickbait framing built around this episode in the weeks that followed? Not a single dramatic reveal. It was more cumulative than that. Watching one of Hollywood's most successful, most controversial directors lay out, in unusually candid detail, exactly how much of his personal theology, his unresolved grief over institutional religion, and his confidence in contested physical evidence went into a film most audiences had only ever experienced as 2 hours of unflinching violence on a movie screen. The film's original defenders always insisted there was more going on beneath the brutality than critics gave it credit for. 20 years later, on a podcast that didn't exist when the movie premiered, its director finally spelled out what that more was supposed to be. Not hidden in the frame, but hidden this whole time in exactly how seriously he wanted you to take it. It took an unscripted 3-hour conversation, far outside the promotional interviews and studio-approved talking points of 2004, for that intention to finally come through in his own words. Unfiltered and occasionally uncomfortable. Exactly the way Gibson seems to prefer saying anything. That's the part worth sitting with, separate from whatever you make of the shroud, debate, or the sedevacantism, or any of the individual claims Gibson made along the way. The filmmaker spent his own money, risked his career, and endured 2 decades of controversy trying to force an audience to physically feel the weight of a 2,000-year-old story instead of just hearing it recited. Whether you find his forensic and theological arguments convincing or not, that underlying motivation, laid out plainly on a podcast in 2025, is the same one that was already sitting in every frame of the film back in 2004. Audiences just didn't necessarily have the context at the time, or the 3 hours of unhurried conversation, to see it that clearly. So the real question isn't whether Mel Gibson revealed some secret buried in the film. It's whether audiences in 2004 were ever really equipped to hear what he was already trying to tell them, and whether a 3-hour conversation on a podcast 2 decades later finally gave him the room to say it in a way a 2-hour film never could.